Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the first of 4 learning spaces under the rubric of Leading Beyond the Blizzard. My name is David Koop, and I direct the Urban and Community Development Program at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. The language of the blizzard will become clear, I think, over time. And this is the first learning space or seminar or webinar, workshop, whatever you want to call it. And this is titled Stop Strategic Planning: Why Leading Beyond the Blizzard Requires a Radical Shift. So while we do a couple minutes of intro here, we're going to also let you answer a poll, which Terry's going to put up for us. A couple of questions. What type of organization are you with? And how do you feel about the future of your organization? If you want to add your thoughts to that, we'll collate them and take a look at the results in a minute. I do want to acknowledge the partners that we have for this series of 4 learning spaces. We're grateful to the collaboration with waybase.com, with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Canadian Christian Relief and Development Association is with us as well, and Wycliffe College. We especially want to acknowledge the funding and support of the Slayton Foundation. And we do want to acknowledge Praxis Labs, Andy Crouch and the crew at Praxis Labs, where we've taken the blizzard language from, and we're building on top of a big discussion that they began 8 months ago and Canadianizing it here in these 4 learning spaces. So if you've had a chance to answer our poll questions, Terry, when you have a chance, you can pop up the results and we'll share those. So 82% of us are specifically with some kind of a nonprofit, 18% from the church. And nobody is very pessimistic about the future of their organization. That's fabulous. Most people, I guess about 84%, are somewhat optimistic or very optimistic. Thank you for sharing that. We will have 1 or 2 other exercises like this during our session together. Well, on March 20th, 2020, near the beginning of the pandemic lockdown, Praxis Labs published an article, and it was titled Leading Beyond the Blizzard: Why Every Organization is Now a Startup. We want to talk about that. That article began intense discussion among thousands of faith-based leaders across North America. In that article, Andy Crouch and Kurt Kielhacker and Dave Blanchard said 5 things, and Lisa's going to take us into the heart of it. But they said things like that the coronavirus is not something just for leaders to get through in a few days or weeks. They predicted quite accurately that COVID-19 would produce an economic and a cultural blizzard, but it would also generate a winter, and that we would walk into something like a mini ice age, a once-in-a-lifetime change that's likely to affect our lives and our organizations for years. They also talked about the fact that many nonprofits and many businesses are effectively out of business as of the beginning of the pandemic and needing to reinvent themselves, partly because a number of the assumptions that underlie what we do no longer apply. And they encouraged leaders to set aside their playbook and think about writing a new one. But they also reminded us that this is a moment for creative potential, even as we make space for grief and lament about what we have been experiencing with the pandemic and what's coming ahead, even as we are still in the middle of it and perhaps even at a peak. They insisted too that they write out of love for Christian organizational leaders and for their work. And we want to approach our time today in a similar way with the same passion for our calling and vocation and for what God is leading us to. Our time is basically structured around a half hour or so with Lisa making a presentation around where she has taken some of this material. We will then transition to some time with a panel, and after about a little over an hour together, we will open up for discussion and dialogue and Q&A with all of us together. We have up to 2 hours if you want to take it, and we're really grateful that you're all here along for the ride. I see about 40 people participating. So let me go ahead and introduce Lisa. Lisa comes to us, I think at least some of the time, from the coast of Maine, which sounds fabulous. But most of the time from Pittsburgh. She is the CEO of Tamim Partners, and she's pretty widely recommended for her approaches to developing leaders, to strengthening and building leadership teams. She was previously the CEO of Pittsburgh Leadership Foundation, in fact, for quite a few years. And there she designed something called Leadership Collaborative for executives in startups, in enterprise corporations, in nonprofits, and in faith groups. Lisa is going to help us grapple with the health of our organizations and our own health as leaders, as innovators, as survivors of this moment, a moment that has so far weighed heavily on us all for 8 months. I also noticed, by the way, Lisa, that you studied at Ray Bakke University, which I think gives you some pretty good urban street cred. So great to have you with us, Lisa.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Yeah, David, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to come and be a part of this. I'm going to bring up my screen in just a second here. I was captivated by this article when it was first published on March the 20th, which was just a few short weeks, not even maybe 10 days after here in the US, our borders were closed. And we went into sort of the first round of blizzard. And immediately I began getting calls from leaders and organizations that I've worked with in the past. So as I began to get calls from leaders and organizations around the country, and I actually had conversations with Andy Crouch, who is a good friend and has been a friend over time, I really appreciated the metaphor and the way that they leveraged it for the purposes of helping us to think about where many organizations were finding themselves. As you may remember, some of you may have seen, there was an article written probably mid-March. I think it was in Forbes or Fortune, I can't remember the source exactly, but it was an interview with an infectious disease specialist named Dr. Michael Osterholm out of the University of Minnesota. And he was quoted as saying, he said, look, I don't think we're in a coronavirus blizzard. In other words, I don't think it's a one and done. I think we're headed into a winter, a coronavirus winter. And just for the purposes of defining our terms, I think the winter is, the blizzard is really about the need to shelter, right? It's too dangerous to go out. That's where we found ourselves early on. And we've got to protect, so we have to shelter. The winter is, we can go out, but not for long. We have to wear protective clothing and monitor the forecast. There may be another blizzard coming, and the need is for survival, right? But then they went on to say, Andy and his team furthered the metaphor and said, maybe we're entering into this season of what they called a mini ice age. that things don't function the way they had in the past, but we seek and find new ways to live. And the need here is to adapt and to build and rebuild and reimagine. And I think that's where, we want to spend our time today. The first article, if you've had a chance to read it, and if you haven't, I commend it to you. It's still very meaningful, even 8 months later. Very provocatively suggested that 80 to 85% of organizations, as David said, were effectively out of business the day that coronavirus really landed in our borders, and that they were going to have to radically rethink everything. And they went on to give some counsel and some ways to think about that in the short term, which many of us have already done. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there because I think we're beyond that in some ways. Looking at conserving cash and examining people resources and all of those things that many of us had to do in those first couple of months, for sure, to say, where are we going to be and how are we going to survive this and move forward? But then they basically went on to say, you've got to examine your playbook, right? And take out, if most organizations, many, particularly those who have done work in the entrepreneurial space, have what's commonly known as the pitch deck, right? They're 10 or 12 slides. It's typically the mission and vision of your organization at the beginning, the things you hold dear in terms of your core values and deeply held convictions and beliefs. And then it goes into the strategy and the financial projections that you would hope for your organization over the coming 3 to 5 years. And what Andy suggested, rightly so, I believe, is that anything after your mission and vision and core values should basically be thrown out the door. And that's a scary thing. We rely heavily on, many of us, on our ability to plan and think strategically and put initiatives into place. But for a lot of us, those initiatives have come to a grinding halt or had to have been reimagined in some very, very radical ways. Probably the single most challenging thing for many, certainly churches for sure, and also nonprofits who rely on gathering people as part of their mission, either in large groups or small groups. Right away, that had to change dramatically. And so many of us figured out how to kind of begin to do our work lives in an online space, which we never imagined that we would have to do at the level that we've had to do over the last number of months. So those are, some of the early and obvious things that emerged out of that. I would suggest that it is absolutely necessary to re-examine your mission and vision and values and make sure that they're still valid, that they still make sense in light of the world that we're living in. I have known organizations to make refinements or adjustments put to both their long-term vision and how they go about realizing that vision in their mission, and to really examine hard the core values that they hold in place. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a couple of minutes. The title of this session was, let's get rid of strategic planning. We can't assume that the strategies that we've put in place are going to hold up. Certainly not going forward. But is strategic planning, trying to predict what we're going to do for the next 12 or 18 or 36 months, really an effective use of time right now? And I would suggest to you, no, it's not in the way that we've done it in the past. And I will talk a lot about that in just a second, because that's where I want to obviously focus our energy. Surely we have to look at our operational environment. This has impacted physical space. It's impacted some of the infrastructure we have in place. We've had to beef up virtual infrastructure and scale back on physical infrastructure. There are all kinds of implications for this. Many of those things you've already done or are still in the process of doing. And certainly it's had financial implications. And I want to just spend a minute here. The article at the time suggested that, and they did a follow-up piece as well that we'll make sure you have a link to in the show notes, what it means to really think and lead strategically through this time. And the follow-up article came a few weeks later, and I've integrated, a lot of the recommendations in there into my presentation today. Financially, most of the NGOs and nonprofits that I work with or am a part of here in the States, I serve on 2 boards, have fundamentally looked at their budgets and scaled them back by anywhere from 30 to 50% going into this next year, and did that even sooner. I met with one large church leader last week, and he said our budget year in some ways is a blessing. It's July 1 to June 30. And so we went into our budgeting period in April and May and into June, really thinking through what it was going to take to run our church, which is a large central church with 7 campuses and some other outreach facilities around our city and region, and say, okay, what is it really going to take to do this? And they scaled back quite considerably. And they had the ability to do that, in a new budget year. But even if you didn't have that opportunity, really taking a hard look, a realistic look at finances is very, very important. And then you really have to look at your people. And if cutting back on staff was part of the plan and had to be part of the plan for financial reasons, who do you have and who do you need to keep, and what's the implication going to be if you let certain roles go? And some of this has to be related to what programs and strategies and initiatives you're going to have to change or shift dramatically over time. So there was lots of moving pieces and parts early on for many of us. But now, kind of where are you, right? And where do you find yourself? We're 8 months into this. I would suggest that Andy and his crew were right. We continue to be in a coronavirus winter. Just before we started the call, Steve Yuko, who is helping to coordinate this, said, we're back in lockdown in Toronto. So maybe we're headed back into a season of blizzard. That certainly seems to be the case here in the United States as we head into a holiday weekend, and their dire warnings about travel and being with family and all of those things. And so the uncertainty and the unpredictability of the current state is pretty significant. And this is a moment as we head into a new year to really take stock and say, where are you? Where do you find yourself in this? I would say we have 2 options for engaging. And it's really important to examine those options carefully and make some choices here. And we can choose to transform. And I do a lot of work in helping people to understand what is really required for transformation. And maybe we can get into a little bit of that in the Q&A, but I outlined some things here that I think are certainly important to pay attention to, or we can choose to maintain, right? And what does it look like to engage fully in this current season? If we're choosing to transform, we're engaging full out, and we have to be willing to take risks. This is not easy in a what we would consider a constrained environment, particularly constrained financially and probably with people resources, but we still have to be able to take risks and be willing to try some things. We have to be able to create and build. We have to hold our hands openly to see what God might bring our way in the process. And we have to think with an abundance mentality, which sounds like an impossible thing to do when it seems like scarcity is everywhere. I just made a quick trip to the grocery store this morning to get some last minute things for the holiday weekend here. And we're back in very little toilet paper and very few paper towels on the store shelves in our grocery stores here, which tells me that there's a scarcity mentality that's pervasive in our world right now. And I understand that. We have to be willing to live into the future and really think through an idea that I'll introduce in a few minutes called enabling practices or emergent practices. We have to embrace the opportunities that come our way, and we have to be willing to lament and then release things instead of hanging on. The contrast to this is, of course, to maintain. Do we play it safe? We minimize and mitigate risk. We go into protection and defensive mode, again, to the scarcity mentality. We live from the past, not the future, and living from the past means that we're relying on best practices We have a fear of the opportunities that come our way, and we are grieving, which we must do, but we're also holding on. We're going to this place of, well, we can go back. Something will change, and we'll be able to go back to the way things were. And I don't think that's the case. I did a series of articles around this that emerged out of conversations I was having here in Pittsburgh back in April with a woman named Audrey Russo, who runs our Pittsburgh Technology Council here for Southwestern Pennsylvania. So they have about 1,400 members, mostly entrepreneurs and founders, a lot of enterprise level technology leaders in our city. And we did a series of interviews that then became a series of articles for me because I got weary of hearing, well, when we go back, when we return to work as normal, back to business as usual, that's not what I think is happening. And I don't think it's going to happen for most organizations going forward. And so I began to look at this as a series of gear shifts that we have to make to how do we move from this choosing to maintain to choosing to transform. And the gear shift metaphor in the articles, which I'm happy to provide as a resource for follow-up, used a series of vehicles that I have driven over the course of my lifetime. And I won't go through all of them now, but you'll get to see the last one here in just a minute. And I identified 4 shifts that I think have to be made. The first one is moving from return to work, this idea that we're going to go back to work as it was, to a realignment to work. And this includes things like workspaces, adjusting to people working from home or working from anywhere, how we help our teams function, particularly in a virtual environment, and how we as leaders and managers think about performance and managing performance in an environment where we don't have physical access and the ability to sit with our people on a regular basis. The second shift is moving from guiding principles or core values to this idea of grounding principles. And what I mean by this is really looking at those core values that we have in place or we've articulated in some way and making sure that we've operationalized them. How are we living them out? Are we embedding them in our actions and our behaviors on a daily basis in our organization? Have people been empowered by the values to make decisions when they're in environments where they might not be able to check in with a leader or a manager, but something has to be done or decided on? And have we communicated as leaders clearly what matters most to us as the organization? Core values or grounding principles always answer the question of what matters most to us. So we may say something matters, but our behaviors and our actions will tell the truth about what really matters most to us. And finally, it allows us to move to a place of self-governance where I feel empowered and you feel empowered to move and make decisions and understand that we're operating out of this common playbook. Getting this clear is far more important than working on strategies right now. The third gear shift that I suggested was necessary, and I've done a lot of work in this space with quite a number of organizations over the last 8 months, is moving from employee engagement to employee well-being. Employee engagement is a commonly known barometer for measuring productivity and effectiveness in organizational lives. There are a lot of surveys that have been developed by the Gallup organization and others over the last 20 plus years. But I think we have to go beyond engagement right now. People are dealing with a level of anxiety and trauma. I had one psychologist colleague say to me early on, he said, Lisa, I think we're all suffering from what I describe as a collective social trauma right now. And so the level of anxiety in everybody, regardless of whether you're being directly impacted in your work life or your family life or your health by COVID or not, is some degree of low level anxiety that exists. And so from a leadership perspective, we have to be able to build trust. We have to create conditions for people to be able to be connected and cohesive with one another, even when they're not physically together. We have to be able to empower people to be able to move and take collective action, build safe environments, and finally, to really think about how we're resourcing our people and our teams for emotional health. So do we have, here in the States, I don't know what it is in Canada, we have employee assistance programs that many companies are able to offer, or counseling services, chaplaincy services. People are a mess. They're trying to navigate daily life and life with children in their homes who are now not in school all the time. Some people, many families are impacted by being out of work, or not having sufficient work, or being in workplaces that are frontline and not feeling particularly safe. How are we helping our people to manage that and navigate that in times of ongoing persistent stress, which is a real recipe for burnout? And then the final shift that I see us making, and this is where I'm going to spend a little bit of time, is moving from problem solving to sense making. Now, what do I mean by this? Problem solving, which is what most of us do, we're looking for cause and effect relationships between what's happened and how we can respond to that. And there's a model I'm going to show you here in a minute, or a framework that I think will be super helpful. This quote, it's comes in a couple different formats. I chose the one from Dwight Eisenhower from back in the 1950s. He said, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." And I think there's some truth to that, and remains true in this environment. Once you've committed the plan to paper, in many cases, it does become a little worthless, because now we go into real-time activity. But the process of planning and engaging people and building those relationships and trust and common sense of purpose around what we're doing and trying to accomplish is absolutely essential. But I loved this, and I've done a lot of work on this over the last number of years, understanding what it means to live in a VUCA world. And VUCA is an acronym that was originally put forth in the late 1980s by Warren Bennis and a couple of other leadership researchers, and became very common language in the military here in the US during the Gulf War and beyond. Stanley McChrystal General Stanley McChrystal was often accredited with using this language. And the VUCA acronym VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think that perfectly describes the world we've been living in for the last number of months, for sure. It is volatile. Things are changing on a daily basis, not just related to the pandemic itself, but related to social conditions, related to economic conditions. We're dealing with huge race issues here in this country. We've just come through a very challenging election that seems to be not getting finalized and going on forever. So it's this constant sense of the world being disrupted, and us not being able to get a clear handle on a certain future. And then this idea of complexity, which is really where sense making comes into place. I love to drive standard cars. And early in my life, I drove a Volkswagen, 1968 Volkswagen that my father had, one of the first Volkswagens that came to the country, actually. And that's the car I learned to drive on. If you've ever driven a Volkswagen Bug or Beetle, you know that as gears go, they're pretty loose. You can grind a little bit, but they're pretty forgiving, and you can learn pretty quickly to drive a standard transmission on a Volkswagen. But last year, my husband and I went to Italy, back in those days when we could travel and go places on airplanes and visit other countries. And part of our trip allowed us to go visit the Lamborghini and Ferrari museums, which is just northwest of Bologna, where we had started our trip. And part of our venture there allowed us my husband to drive a Ferrari. We purchased 20 minutes of time to drive a Ferrari on the open road. And this was kind of a dream for him. And as we were getting in the car, I got to sit in this little tiny back seat. The driver, or the companion who went with us, obviously protecting his vehicle worth several $100,000, wasn't going to just let Roger take it out on the open road, turned to me and he said, "Do you want some time to drive at the end?" And I, without really thinking about it, said, "Sure, I'd love to try it." And so we got in the car and Roger drove off, and the gentleman was giving him instructions on how to navigate the open road and when to pull back and when to accelerate. And we got the car up to, I think he got the car up to 140 or 150 miles an hour on open roads, which was a little terrifying. And as we were coming to the end of our time, the gentleman, Matteo was his name, turned to me and said, "Okay, are you ready to drive?" And I kind of froze like a deer in the headlights and said, "I don't think so. I think this is way more car than I know how to handle." And so in probably one of my more generous wifely moves over 39 years of marriage, I gave my husband Roger the last few minutes of driving the Ferrari on the open road. This was a complex vehicle. Moving it from first gear to second gear was no simple thing. And in the short amount of time that we had left, I knew I had no idea how to make sense of this. And so it was more out of my fear than generosity probably, but he got the benefit of that. When we move into a place of trying to make sense out of complexity, we have to be able to come to a place of hopelessness, right? Like we don't know what to do. And then you become open to new possibilities. We have to be able to make decisions, but not definitive decisions. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in just a second. And we have to be able to analyze data, not just from a purely statistical perspective, but through the lens of thick data to make meaning out of it. And then finally, to get to this place of emerging practices. For the last several years, I have been learning from and working with a model by a man named David Snowden. He's out of Wales, and he developed this framework called the Cynefin framework around complex adaptive systems quite a number of years ago. And obviously in this season, understanding complexity and making sense of complexity has become a pretty hot topic. And I started learning from David several years ago. There's another great book that I'll reference you to called Canoeing the Mountain. Some of you may be familiar with it. Todd Bolsinger, who is a professor out of Fuller Seminary in Southern California, wrote a book called Canoeing the Mountain a few years ago. And in there, he unpacks this model in a particular way for Christian organizations, which is super helpful. But what Snowden basically was articulating is that we live in uncertain times, and that's not really changing. And we have ways of understanding how to make sense of predictable situations, as you see on the right there, which we'll call clear, the simple things. We sense what's going on, we quickly categorize it, and then we respond. And this is the place where best practices are most useful, where we have simple, repeatable processes or structures that we can reuse and regurgitate and reuse over and over again. But then we're faced with more complicated problems. And as leaders, this is where we tend to spend most of our time. This is problem solving. These are, if the clear, predictable conditions are algebra or addition and subtraction problems, complicated problems get up in the space of algebra and maybe even calculus, where we have to sense and analyze and then respond. So we have to do some analysis in there. We have to take in a lot of data and try and understand what it's telling us, and then we respond. We problem solve. This is engineering at its finest, right? And most of our time in organizational life is spent in this space. But then we move to the chaotic, which is what some of us experienced that middle week of March when the world seemed to come to an end. And we just had to act and then sense and respond. It was like, what do we do? How do we get people safe? What are the conditions that we can create? How can we get people to work from home? And we respond to that, but that's not a sustainable place of being. If we live in chaos all the time, we're in trouble. And that is not how we want to manage, but we're moving into this place of complexity. And complexity requires a different skill set. And we have to go to this place of probing, which means that we have to get curious, right? Asking questions, learning and understanding what people are experiencing. And from that, we begin to make sense of how we can be responsive. and we make a move. We make a step. We make a step to the left or a step to the right, and we pay attention over time to the impact and implication of that step, and then we make another adjustment along the way. But we cannot move out to a long-term plan. And I think we are all living in this place of complexity, which means that we're going to be doing this dance for quite some time. Here are just a few of the things that I've helped people to work on and put in place in some organizations. First of all, we've got to start with a language of humility. It's okay not to know in this situation. As leaders, we're very often accustomed to having all the answers, and the person that people come to get the answer when they don't know what to do. And we're supposed to tell them, well, we don't know either. And it's okay to say that. We don't want to create an environment where people don't have confidence, but we also need to they need to understand that we can't possibly figure out how to respond in some of the things that we've been presented with in the current environment. One of the things that I've done is to activate these pods, I call them, for diverse insights and innovation. And this goes back to this idea of thick data, where we might be taking in lots of data and information statistically or quantitatively. But when we activate a pod, and in organizational life, one of the things that I found to be very helpful is to pair people up who normally would not be working together. So it could be someone who's more senior in the organization, who's been around for a while, someone in the middle of the organization who's got some experience and managerial capabilities, and then maybe it's someone newer to the organization or younger who has new perspective, and for them to gather or touch base on a weekly basis around a set of questions to help them begin to share an experience. And this is not about the more senior person having the power. It's really about how do we learn together, and what are we seeing commonly across the organization, and allow these pods and the stories that come out of them to inform how we're interpreting our data. We do have to communicate with speed, and we make these minimum viable decisions, right? So based on what we're seeing and learning, we're going to make a small decision and then course correct as we go, instead of making tons of big decisions all at once. Making smaller incremental decisions over time is going to be more helpful. The expanded data collection to mine for thick data is really what the pods are all about. And then being able to take the pulse of your organization. It can be checking in with folks individually as you have time, polling and seeking feedback around what's going on. So this is a way to consider thinking about moving in complex environments when typical problem solving skills won't work. I think we're going to move into discussion now. I just want to give you a final, not a benediction necessarily, but hopefully an encouragement. One of the Psalms that's been most meaningful to me in my own journey, when I wake up in the middle of the night and have those just incredible moments that I'm sure we've all had of being terrified or deeply uncertain about what's next, comes from Psalm 77. I really landed on this psalm in the days after 9/11 here almost 20 years ago now in the US. And it was a psalm that carried me very strongly through those times. I've pulled out verses 6 through 13 here, but I want to point out the verse that's most meaningful. In the middle, it says, "Then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder your work, and I will meditate on your mighty deeds. Your ways, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God?" And I think in this psalm, there's a promise that God is present with us, even when he feels absent. And that he can be trusted and can be counted on, and that he remains sovereign in this world that feels very chaotic and very uncertain to us in our human capacity. And it doesn't mean that we're going to go back to the way things were, but just that we know God can be trusted, that he's given us evidence of that in his word, and through his actions and through the experiences that we ourselves have had over the course of a lifetime. So this is a really big topic to cover in 30 minutes. Hopefully I've given you some snapshots, and now I'm really looking forward to moving into a time of discussion. Just quickly, here's my contact information. Feel free to look me up or send me an email afterwards. I'd be happy to talk to you and hopefully be helpful in some ways. And now, David, I think we're back to you to move into a discussion time.
Lisa, this is fabulous. Thank you so much. I counted at least 6 or 7 issues that I think people will want to assess and address and question. So 2 instructions. One is, please, all participants start to use the Q&A tab at the bottom, probably at the bottom of your screen. You can enter questions and observations and comments there, and we'll start collecting those during the panel discussion. And when we transition to our open discussion and dialogue, this will be the content and ammunition for our gathering. Second, how about another little poll? We're going to send you to slido.com, which I believe is appearing in the chat box for everyone. So go to that link. The question that we're asking you is, over the past 6 to 8 months, what resource have you found most helpful? Just list 1 or 2 words, a phrase. It might be a person, a human being. It might be another organization. It might be something that you found in print, in a book or an article. It might be a program or a piece of training that has been profoundly helpful in the midst of the last 6 to 8 months. But if you can go to slido.com and enter as many times as you like things that have been very helpful to you, this is another way of collecting resources and taking the pulse on the kinds of places we're going to actually figure out how to be leaders and build good leadership teams in the midst of this moment. So Q&A button, slido.com. We'll take a look at the resources as they emerge. Terry's going to share the screen of results as they start to come through. So our panel discussion includes a couple of folks that I am very, very pleased to have joined us. These are 2 of the most, I think, experienced and proficient networkers in Canada's faith space. There's so much contextual wisdom and knowledge, I think, in this Zoom room on our panel. So let me introduce to you the panelists. First is Bruce Clemenger. Bruce, as many of you know, comes from the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada as president, which is an organization that I think a lot of us know. EFC, for me, has functioned for many years as a meeting point. And EFC has several hundred affiliates. These include congregations, denominations, faith-based organizations. I think also lots of educational institutions like Wycliffe are members there. If my math is right, I think in a year or 2, Bruce will be celebrating his 30th anniversary with EFC. Is that possible?
It's possible.
But Bruce is a leader, and he's especially experienced at herding cats, I think, in his work at EFC with these hundreds of members. And I've always seen Bruce as something of a religion and culture and policy wonk. As you can imagine, Bruce has extensive networks from coast to coast in Canada with Christian leaders and key policymakers. He speaks and writes continuously on religion, culture, ethics, and politics, and he's regularly on your secular and religious media stations. I'd also really like to introduce to you Tim Day, who is the director of waybase.com. And Waybase is a pretty new platform, although it's already going into Waybase 2.0 if you look at the site. Waybase has, I think, over 30,000 listings in Canada that help people like you and me and people in ministry to find each other, to partner together, and to begin to demonstrate and measure collective impact. If you go to the website, you can learn about it there. You can join up and begin to explore it. Tim also serves as the executive director of City Movement Canada. And previously he was at the Meeting House for 14 years in a senior role. And I think many of you probably know the Meeting House is a multi-site, multi-city church in central Ontario. He has authored God Enters Stage Left, which is his creative retelling of the divine story. I'm told, by the way, that you can view the results of the word cloud on the site as they have emerged. So you can do that anytime by going back to the link. So my initial question for Bruce and for Tim is just your key question or observation you have in digesting what Lisa has shared with us. Do you want to start us off that way?
Really appreciated everything Lisa was sharing, and the way that she framed it as a shift, and a pretty complex shift. I think one of the greatest challenges that I've observed we've done some surveys across the country in the spring when this first happened, and then again partnered with EFC on both surveys, and then again this fall, is recognizing that certain tactical moves, like just switching things online, kind of like a grocery store being able to order online or particular services, those things are obvious, but the next level of shifting is much more complex. And I think Lisa, you did an excellent job mapping that out. And I think today's discussion, maybe if we could explore really like those 4 quadrants, maybe I'd like to highlight that as what stood out to me, because it's a different skill set that most of us as leaders have never had to branch out of our normal quadrant. Most of us are are categorizers or maybe analyzers. But when you go into the unpredictability where we are, my first thought that really jumps out, and maybe it's a question, is can we dialogue more around those types of skills? Like what's needed and how does that actually apply in a Christian not-for-profit or church setting, which itself has tended to generally be kind of the, how do you say, like, we are the people who maintain the faith of a tradition that is 2,000 years old. So we tend to lean harder into continuity than to radical innovation and pioneering new space. Okay, maybe it is, is that fair to say? And so I think when we get into this space, that's what really jumped out to me, and I really appreciated you, making it so clear and obvious to us.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond to that a little bit, Tim? Would that be helpful? Okay, I don't know if I'm showing up on the screen or not, but hopefully you can hear me. I have found that framework to be enormously helpful over my work of the last 10 or 12 years. I first discovered it in a Harvard Business Review article that was published in about 2007 or 8. And I think it's the space that most confounds leadership, that upper left quadrant, right? Because everything we've learned to do is problem solving in orientation, and the simpler problems we push down, and delegate those, but the more complicated problems are the ones that often land on our desk. And we can't solve this right now. This is not a problem to be solved, right? It's a situation or a circumstance to engage. And I don't think we have to lose the goodness of the tradition, right? And of our Christian history, to be open to what God is going to do in the midst of this. It requires a posture of humility. And I think we've gotten a little trapped by our structures and our processes, both in the church and I'll say this in a lot of Christian nonprofits who are very committed to a mission, but how they're going to accomplish that mission needs to be completely reimagined, and they're more attached to the strategies than they are actually sometimes to the mission. And this is a season to let go of strategy. You look at the early church and I mean, my goodness, it was persecution, right? So it was all organic, and they were paying attention to where they were and responding and engaging people right where they were, rather than trying to bring a formal ecclesial structure to bear. It wasn't how the church grew and spread. And I think we have to go back and look at the organic nature of the church, not just the institutional nature of the church and the Christian community. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one comment or observation I'd make based on what you said, Tim.
If I can build on that, I agree. I was really struck by the complex, the probe, sense, respond.
Yeah.
Certainly back in March, April, is more of the chaotic, act, sense, and then respond.
Right.
So for our role, a really strong emphasis on engaging with government, looking at subsidies, those kind of issues, trying to anticipate what the needs of our affiliates would be, how they're impacted differently. Our organization itself, we're not dependent upon the gathering of large numbers of people. So a lot of our work could continue on as usual. We'd already gone to a distributed office, so most people were set up to work at home remotely. So that just became more of a regular factor. But as things gone on, it's more of a probing. And we talked about 2 millennia of tradition. I've go to 2 centuries. And what I'm wondering, and I've had a number of conversations with people about, is what COVID-19 has done is actually it's disclosed a number of issues that we've been feeling the last 200 years, shifting from a Christendom to kind of a post-Christendom environment.
Mm-hmm.
Our churches are still built and kind of look like they did 50, 60 years ago. Have there been some shifts taking place? This morning I was talking to a lawyer from downtown Toronto and talked about tectonic plates shifting. Has there been shifts been taking place for the last few generations that we've ignored, or we've kind of felt the tremors, but we've carrying on? And is COVID-19 in a sense shifting us, breaking us out of some of those old practices and ideas? And so now we definitely are in an area of probing. For me, the answer to the question that we asked the panel, everyone to respond to, would probably be collaboration. For me, the key thing the last number of months has been collaboration, talking to my peers, finding out how other associations are functioning, how educational institutions are functioning, denominations, local church, and trying to get a sense of what's shifting and where can we anticipate the shifts taking place and moving forward, and do we have to fundamentally rethink our ecclesiology or missiology? So I'm now starting to think about 3 to 5 year period of time to try to understand the dynamics and then figure out, okay, then what's EFC's role within that? So
Sure.
it's refining, it's honing down on mission, clarifying mission, not going outside of your lane in a sense, but also working collaboratively with others to decide what's this new what's emerging and how can we collaboratively respond.
Yeah. Bruce, you described something that I want to talk about as being very important, and you use the language of collaboration. It's also the language of curiosity, right? So it's really getting curious. And one of the biggest challenges I think many of us face who have been around for a while and leading in our organizations and in our networks and circles is we know a lot of stuff. We're pretty smart. And as one of my longtime colleagues has often said, what we know gets in the way of what we need to learn. So this is an opportunity to move out of, all the stuff we know, and into a space of curiosity and what do I need to learn here? What is showing up? To your point, what is emerging? And then how do I respond to that? Because new things are going to emerge out of this that we could not have predicted in any way. And we have to be open to that and respond to that, right? So it is a very significant mindset shift.
Lisa, if I could, pick up on that, one of the things I've observed is in the space of trying to get oriented yourself as a leader, there are some leaders that are vocal. They're quite vocal. When things are disruptive, they tend to raise their volume. And one group of leaders, which is more like the strong, innovative voice. This is the time, throw it all out, scrap it, start from the, ground up. Nothing's going to work. And it just sounds like an apocalypse to some. Then there's another group, which is more, I would say, is like the entrenched denial, we're really kind of digging into form and structure and, we're going to fight for our rights, you know what I mean? To hang on to how it was. But then there's most people live kind of in this middle space that are like, we know it's not like some stuff's going to carry and some stuff's not going to carry on long term. We knew that things were changing. Now this is speeding up. And how do we navigate this season of curiosity? And I like what you said there, but it's almost like you have to turn down some of those voices that are on the fringe to sit in this middle and think, okay, kind of like Jeff Bezos building around what will never change. That's just part of human life, but recognizing change is afoot, and this is sped up. And I love what you said, Bruce. This is revealing something that maybe, and this is happening to other sectors of society. It's revealing and speeding up a change process that we're in the midst of, but maybe we weren't embracing as fully. Maybe we were living in a little bit of denial or just trying to hang on. And so I don't know, Lisa, if you have any reaction to that, of kind of quieting down some of those extreme voices to find this middle ground of discussion, kind of like Bruce, you're saying, you're building a middle ground of discussion where we can link arms together in this and maybe even find some new strength in the midst of not knowing what we're doing.
Well, I do think that's possible for sure. The image that came to mind is one I often use when I'm working with organizations. They're the organizations that are so institutionalized, right? They have all their systems and structures in place, and they're pretty locked and loaded on how they do things, and that's a posture, that's a way of being. And then as you described, there's the startup mode, right? The chaos of a new thing, and there's just you throw everything out and you start all over again. But the place that you want to see come together there isn't just a messy middle, although it'll feel messy for a bit. The opportunity is for that to become a truly generative space, right? Where we can assess and say, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we also know that so we're going to keep some things in place that we know provide solid foundation or consistency. We'll examine them as we go. And we have to be open to trying new things and taking risks and prototyping. One of the suggestions that's in, I can't remember which of the two articles that Andy and the Praxis Labs produced, was do this, prototyping, where you're running things in 2 or 3 week sprints and trying some things and seeing how people respond to them, and then adjusting from there. Not everything has to be attached to a long-term plan, right? And so how do we begin to test some things out and pilot some things, we call them low risk experiments. And I think that's absolutely necessary in organizational life right now. But it's hard when people are very attached to the structures and systems and the ways things have been done. In my world of organizational development and working with complex adaptive systems, the most expensive sentence I can hear any leader say is, "That's how we do things around here." Right? It's there, right, all the time. And so we have to be willing to let go of, release some of those things. And I know Andy's bookending this series, so you'll have him in February, I think, as part of this discussion. And he's going to talk about lamenting and grieving, because we do have to create space for people to let go of, particularly those people who have strong attachments to the old way of doing things that we know isn't going to work anymore. So how do we honor that, but then create the space, this generative middle space where things look a little messy and uncertain for a while until we see what emerges out of them? So that's one response to your comment, Tim, and I think
and I think for us the trick is finding that balance. I mean,
Mhm.
we just adopted a strategic plan within last year, and actually we reviewed it with this in mind, and much of it is still valid for us.
Mhm.
But at the same time, we know we need to do more of a deep dive. A lot of the assumptions in the strategic plan need to be rethunk and tested, and that we can do that, at the same time. And so for me, it's the clarifying of missions critical. And that's where, in collaboration and talking to peers and leaders of other organizations, it's really honing down, because there's often the danger of mission creep, where you say, oh, that's an interesting idea, I think I'll move into that, or go over here. And often it's areas that other organizations probably are better suited to engage in. And so I think it's the clarity of mission, then you consolidate towards that mission, make sure it's really focused. And that's where our strategic plan helped, because our strategic plan was really rooted in our mission.
Yeah.
And then again, it's the issue of the probing, of the making sense and responding. And so and it's finding that balance within an organization to carry on what makes sense and continue to be carry on, to continue to make plans, but also create space for testing assumptions underneath the plan itself,
Mhm. I
and
think that's
giving
right.
yourself permission to take, as I said, 3 to 5 years, take some time to think it through. And as you noted, you can experiment along the way. You can probe and test and prompt conversations and see what sticks to the wall and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's right.
One of the quotations that comes from the original article from March 20th, which really has stuck with us and has been part of our conversations about how to structure this space, is this one. The strange heart of Christian faith is that these are not separate realities. Grief and loss go together in Christian faith with vision and hope in a singular way, because they are the story of the cross and the resurrection. There's no greater grief than Calvary, the crucifixion of the very Son of God by the ones he came to save. There's no greater hope than Easter. And I like this realization, and I think you've highlighted it, Bruce, that COVID has been exposing some things. And I wonder, in this sense, whether it's also driving us back to a theology of change, or maybe a theology of or a theory in the theology of change for our organizations that tackles maybe what we've assumed for a while in our context, which might be the myth of progress, or even kind of a prosperity theology, that we're going to get bigger and bigger and always grow and have more impact, et cetera, et cetera. Let me ask you, what do you think is a healthy theology of change here, or a theology of crisis for faith-based organizations and for churches 8 months into this moment? And what are you hearing, I guess, from all these organizations you're working with in your networks about how they're beginning to rethink theologically where they are and where they're going?
I'll jump in on that one. I think it's a very, very good question. And I think it's a question like, David, what you said is we can subtly have, especially as leaders who have to win trust and get people rallying behind us and moving somewhere, kind of sneak into a success validates my vision. And we kind of adopt those terms. We don't have good categories, maybe especially in the Western world, the history of the Western world, for another way to look at it. I agree that, if I can put it in a person's life, an individual life, we often have that same sense of the individual discipleship journey. that in a sense, my own personal growth should always be upward, 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 upward. And we don't really plan ahead for, unexpected things that may cause great grief or great loss. The loss of a child, this sickness and death of a loved one. We don't anticipate bad things coming, and then we get blindsided. And this concept of progressing with God on a journey and being changed by all that comes with that journey is probably an area that in the West, because we have so much comfort, we have so much success, we may say something on a Sunday morning message, but our lived reality and how, coming back to the grounding principles, how do we actually operationalize it? How do we live? We may not live our theology.
Yeah.
We may actually live a kind of an organizational success mentality, just like we do in our own personal discipleship. So if I was going to come back to it, I think this is a space in this long winter for there to be more conversation about this, not just about the organizational issues, but particularly, at least when you're talking about shifting from engagement to well-being. How do we talk in a meaningful way about what we're going through? Because people are going to start feeling things they've never felt before.
That's right.
They're going to start feeling things that are going to be, they'll find out later, are mental health issues. They're going to find that they have emotional trauma that is starting to affect them over time. And the question is, where is God in all of this?
Yeah.
And I think in the same way in the organization, there's an opportunity for us to almost, I would say, take the theology that probably many of us know, but apply it in a real world context, individually and organizationally, that may mature us. Like, I see this as a progress towards a deeper maturation.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, Bruce, to you or Lisa or David.
Yeah. I'll add here. I'm sure, Bruce, you have some great things to share as well. I think I will say, in my experience in working with many churches and church leaders and nonprofits across the country, we have a very poor theology of suffering, and this is revealing that, right? People in Western culture want quick fixes, and we don't want to be held captive. I think that's what I'll speak for the US. I think that's what we're seeing in the US. It's why the COVID pandemic hasn't been contained, because people don't want to be constrained in any way from doing the things they want to do that make them feel better. And it's a highly individualistic, autonomous way of living in the world, but it doesn't consider loving your neighbor very well, right? And loving your neighbor requires suffering and sacrifice in this current environment. And I don't think we've been discipled that way. And so is this an opportunity for churches to really help people to understand that suffering and sacrifice is the way of the cross, and that's what God may be calling us to in this season. That's where the opportunity is. We just think we're in that constant up and to the right progression of of human flourishing, where things are going to get better and better and better, and that's not actually how it works. We all know that, but that's the expectation that we've set for the Christian life, and so people are now, they don't know what to do. We haven't equipped them for this.
It's interesting. The mantra in March, April, May was, "We're all in this together." I'm not sure how it resonated in the US, but in Canada, that was the mantra. Well, I think that's going to start. That's already starting to break down. And there are some that have done well during the restrictions. There's some that have maintained, and there's others who have been destroyed by it. And I think the psychological, the emotional toil will become manifest in the weeks, months, years to come, even once we have a vaccine, if we get herd immunity or whatever that might be. And so I think that's where, what is the role of the local church? What's my role in not only within my family and extended family context, but in my neighborhood and my community?
Yeah.
And in reaching out and caring for those who have been left behind. We've been taught to bubble up. Well, that means that's exclusionary as well. And we probably bubble up with people that are like us, social, economically, theologically, whatever, right? And then how do we train ourselves to break down those bubbles and reach out and care for the neighbor who is probably not like us. The other thing, I'm not sure, it's not a theology, but I'm starting, I did this with my staff last week. Ecclesiastes 11. I won't go through it all, but there's three things we don't know. We don't know what disaster may happen on the earth, but it's in the context of being generous, right? We don't know the work of God who makes everything. We really don't know what God's doing amongst all this, but the response is to be focused. And we really don't know what will prosper, this or that, but the idea is to be diligent. So to me, it's not a theology yet, it's more of a devotional, but to me, the response is, there is uncertainty. There is that chaos, but we are called to be generous. And the idea here is you're generous because you know there will be disaster coming. But even when in the midst of disaster, you need to be generous. You need to be focused, mission. What is your task? What are your greatest abilities? How do you contribute? And then also be diligent. And you don't become distracted by the events around you, but you continue to pursue your mission. You continue to be diligent. You try various things. You continue to probe. So I think it gives a framework for me in terms of what we're called to be and to do, which fits into that idea of what does it mean to love our neighbor as an expression of our love for God.
I think we have space for maybe one last question on the panel before we open up for Q&A. I'm trying to digest as we go along here. And I think the thing that's really outstanding to me that we haven't perhaps discussed directly is that we're all, and I know I'm coming across leaders, leadership teams, students, pastors, priests, who are tired. In fact, many of them are bone tired, and many are anxious and they're staring into the unknown. I think Tim has articulated well that we're living kind of in between the extremes of innovation and creativity, and what Andy and his team have talked about as lament and loss and grief. Yeah. We're somewhere in the middle, but some of us are feeling the extremes more on the tiredness side. I think the exhaustion, even while we're looking for opportunities. I guess my question would be, what would you say about self-care?
Yeah.
At this moment? What would you say about being both, wonderfully optimistic and opportunistic, but also giving space for grief and lament, and even place to take a breath and recover, etc. I mean, I do have some observations on that.
Yeah, so at the risk of sounding self-promotional, I'm actually doing a discussion on this on December 2nd with the folks at Fuller who run the Dupree Center. And I think, there's a risk of appointing us immediately to adopting better spiritual practices and, rediscovering spiritual disciplines. And I think that's good. I think that's part of self-care. But I also think we have to do better as leaders who measure ourselves on our productivity, as giving ourselves the freedom to not be as productive some days, that it's just too much. I can't do 9 Zoom calls in a row, without my brain just getting fried by the 4th or 5th one and I'm not useful, and creating the space for grief and loss. Whether that's personal, if you've lost a relationship, someone has been impacted by the pandemic or something else, or just the loss of the life that you had before. We're all grieving that. And leaders are terrible at giving themselves permission to create the space for that. So it means you don't have to have your phone on 24 hours a day. It means you don't have to pack your schedule from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, even though you can do all of those things. So even the little shifts that we can make in creating space for our own mental and emotional and spiritual well-being is important. And I don't think you can do that by yourself, right? I think, who is that small community of people that you're regularly in touch with who are supporting you in those practices and helping you to give yourself permission? Because it feels like we're on a roller coaster that we can't get off of. And sometimes we just have to push the pause button and say, enough, I need downtime, I need a break, I need to remove myself from the activity and the productivity. So that's not an easy thing, but I think it's necessary in this season.
I have a few thoughts maybe I can add, Lisa, from my own kind of reflecting on this. I describe it as being in a perpetual exam.
Yeah.
It's like I'm back in doing my master's and I'm in exam week, and every week is exam week. Like I'm that tired from the mental focus required. Yeah. I also ran across an article about doom scrolling, and that people are in a threat detection, unconscious threat detection mode. The combination of COVID, economic uncertainty, presidential elections, unstable world. We've had terrorism for a while, but that's still, we're in detection mode. And so you're kind of constantly checking, you don't even realize it, you're constantly checking sources to see if something bad happened. And I think for some leaders, packing their day full of Zoom calls and really packing it out is a form of protection. In other words, if I don't really keep locked and loaded here, something may bad happen to my organization. I may miss something. I may miss an opportunity. I'm unplugged. I'm at risk. By being plugged in and being kind of like locked in everywhere, it means my channels are always open to find out if something bad's going to happen. And I haven't been found sleeping at the wheel during a catastrophe type thing, something like that. It's not conscious, but I've seen the level of activity compared to what we were before just keep scaling. And everybody's home at their laptop and they're booking Zoom meetings, and it just locks in like morning till night. And I see some correlation with the doom scrolling, that kind of fear of detection, which then I think comes back to that other question of vulnerability and being able to meet God in our most vulnerable places. Can I unplug for a full day, turn everything off, book it away, and go into a more vulnerable space where I just sit with God and let everything catch up to me? Or maybe I only have a phone call with a close trusted friend who I trust their voice, and we just sit and talk about how I'm doing and how they're doing, and we pray together. And it's not on Zoom, it's just voice to voice. I find empathy moves a lot better when it's just, if I can't be in person, I'd rather just hear their voice than to be on Zoom. I feel like I pick up, for me personally, I pick up a lot more empathy responses just on the phone if I can't be face to face. But that kind of thing for me is it's a deeper question that sometimes is hard to get at, because a lot of these behaviors I find in myself or I'm talking to other leaders are unconscious kind of things.
Yeah.
They're self-protective things. They're ways of, like I said, I might be an extrovert. I might measure my productivity. I may feel fear about my job. And these things just kind of lay in the background and keep me going. But then I miss the chance to meet with God and allow something deeper to take place.
If I can identify with perpetual exam and threat detection mode, yeah, I feel that, and it is draining. It's, again, how long can you sustain in a crisis or in a times of uncertainty, and how do you find rest? To me, it also comes back to Sabbath. And do we practice Sabbath? And do we not practice it because we think we're too busy? Or, that another hour here or checking email, whenever it might be, is somehow beneficial, or again, because of that threat, right? You're want to be completely on top of possibilities. So for me, it just comes back again, it's a basic spiritual discipline. And if you haven't been practicing it, it's hard to develop that practice in a crisis, but it can be done. And it does mean, Friday evening till Saturday evening or whatever it happens to be, you turn off your device, and you center down, you turn off the TV, you turn off the electronic medium, And for me, it means shifting to devotional books rather than philosophy, culture, politics, the stuff I normally read during the week. So it's a shift in reading, and it's an anticipation that that will benefit me and family for that period of time, and it kind of a restoration, renewal to kind of engage again. It's hard to practice, especially in this, our connected, technologically mediated world, but it can be done, and I think it's an important discipline.
Yeah.
And begins to offset and mediate those stressors.
That was profound, all three of you. Thank you.
Mm.
We have some minutes to open up to folks who are with us participating. Terry, are we going to go to gallery mode, or what is the plan? Anyway,
we're currently in gallery mode right now.
Okay. Okay, so I don't see anybody except the panel. So we do have a couple of questions that have arrived from the Q&A, and Terry has encouraged me to let you know that if you want to make a comment or throw in a question, you can also raise your hand, and Terry can see you and enable you to do that live. So please feel free to do that. We have this question from Manuel. What and how can networking contribute to shift gears, and how can it be done effectively? Given that we have expert networkers here, there's a really good group of people to ask this question to. What and how can networking contribute to shifting gears, and how can it be done effectively? Who has a thought on that?
Well, I know Manuel, and he's actually quite an expert on networking.
Yes. Maybe Manuel has an answer.
I'd like to, hear his answer. I guess for me, again, it's the peer relationships, and it's understanding. I hear the extreme. If we talk about those extreme voices, then those in the middle. And I try to connect as often as possible with those who are in the middle, who are asking those probing questions, and while maintaining structures, institutions. So they're kind of living that dual-edged life. And again, just having those kind of conversations with them. It's kind of partly devotional, it's partly prayerful, but it's also collaborative, and it's kind of our sounding board. But how can it be done? It needs to be done. I'm not sure how it can be done more effectively, or how effective it can be. I'm not sure if what I'm doing is as effective as it could be, but that's what I take from the question. It's so important that we continue to have these conversations. And what it does is it balances out those extremes, but also there's wisdom in the talking one with another.
I think I'd add to that, Bruce. I think being really intentional about who you listen to and who you're engaging matters. And if I'm wrestling with a question or trying to gain insight around a particular thing, going to someone who I know has some knowledge or history or background around that to probe, right, their insight, and then ask them to point me to someone else I might engage around the topic or the conversation or the issue, whatever it is. Networking can get frantic, right? Because it's more activity that we're doing, and it makes us feel productive. Well, I talked to 11 people today, but if it's not purposeful and intentional, then it's not gonna bear fruit. And so I think we want to be really thoughtful about who we engage and how we engage them, as we're undertaking some of these big challenges, and who can resource us. And then down the road, we become a resource for them as well. There's always mutuality in that process. So.
Mhm. Maybe a thought I'll add to it, and building on what's been said. Networking is essentially opening yourself up to a new relationship.
Mhm.
And that maintaining that relationship means you need time and energy for that new relationship. And so networking can, like you said, create a lot of frenetic activity or not go anywhere at the end. The thought that I have is, if we're thinking about networking right now or building new relationships right now, I think for a lot of Christian organizations that have tended to live within established networks and leaders who have established networks, is when we're in the middle of a global pandemic and we have a pandemic hitting our city, our communities, if we're a type of ministry that is related to our local communities, in other words, we're not international development or offering kind of a national specialization, but we're actually connected to our communities. One of the things I've found is that Christian leaders are not well situated to really know their cities very well.
That's right.
And they tend to live within a denominational or a faith tradition channel or a network of friends, and they really don't know their city. And I would say that some of the work that we're doing with Waybase, I'll give an example of this in terms of how the silos exist. Just this week, I had a conversation with the Speaker of the House. I supported a leader working with the conversation of the House of the Alberta legislature. And that Speaker of the House had no idea how big the Christian sector was in Edmonton, in Red Deer, in Calgary. And I was helping them get oriented to the Christian sector, its services, what it provided, different languages, how to explore it. I've done this before in cities. Most Christian leaders have no sense of what's in their city.
right.
Most civic leaders have no sense of what resources are in the Christian sector. And this is a personal passion of mine and our work with what we're going to be doing in the new year with Waybase and coming back on some city tours, visiting 30 cities, 35 cities around this issue. Regardless of what we do, I would say I can't think of a better time to strengthen the networking at a community level right now, to open ourselves up to the needs of the community. And there's some very, very practical needs that exist, not just food banks, but people who are involved in adoption services. And there's a whole variety of vulnerable populations right now that are particularly exposed. That we as a church, if we could make that new relationship, would open up something very simple we could do that would be helpful.
Yeah.
But if we don't have that relationship, we won't know.
Following on that, Sam Chase has a question, which I think is really quite related, Tim, to what you just said. Sam is asking, what are some concrete practices that leaders can enact on a regular basis that will cultivate within themselves and within their organizations a posture of probing and of sense making? I guess I'm alluding to your community assessment reality as part of that sense making around where we are and who's there and who's doing what, etc. But perhaps there's also an internal dimension to this as well as other external options. So do we have some concrete practices that we use or that we recommend to leaders?
Yeah.
I'll jump in with the silence. Knowing your mission field or your scope that you operate in, you kind of set that, okay, this is my zone. Mapping, like, how do I map this and continually be in a process of mapping? Not seeing it as like a planning thing that I do once and I forget about, but creating the meaningful touch points within that zone. And this is what I like, Lisa, what you talked about, creating pods and creating different points of regular connectivity and connection. So that I'm listening. I've set a web out, almost like listening stations around, that I have ears now to hear what's going on in my zone.
Yeah.
And then be able to keep that refreshed and evergreen. Okay, what's happening? And that's a different mode of existing than saying, I open my doors, and people who come in my doors, I offer these services. And you can always know at this time and place, I'll be here for you. It's really turning the whole bag inside out and dumping
That's right.
everything out and saying, I now am actually extending myself, and I'm getting really clear in my mind, my mission field. So I'll say, practically speak, I'll give something for a church. Calling through all of your members using the well-being matrix. We're just going to phone through and touch
Yeah.
base with you, not an email. Just ask, how are you doing? How are your neighbors? How's your job going? Do you have elderly parents? And keeping a little record, a simple record of how everybody's doing. Have a regular touch base. What's going on in your community? Is there anything that you think we as a church maybe could do that might respond to a need that you're aware of? That's a perpetual
Right.
probing exercise, essentially. It's keeping that open. But the sense making then is taking all that data back in and starting to look at and say, okay, as we navigate these waters,
What are we learning?
what are we learning, and what do we need to maybe put in place that allows us to kind of surf along these waters here with our people? And that might be some new teams that get formed to respond to that networking experience.
Yeah.
So that's like it's kind of like a paradigm that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think your shift, Tim, is really important from from keeping my doors open and being available, right, for people to come to me, and saying, no, I'm going to go out and touch people and engage them where they are, and find out what's going on is a radical shift. For many leaders, particularly in service-based organizations, right? They're so busy providing their service that they've lost sight of who their customer is, to use business language. And this is an opportunity to re-engage and find out where people really are and what they're experiencing, right? And how can we learn from that? It is the primary skill of empathy building, that deep listening. And we're seeing it play out on a national and international stage, the lack of empathy that exists for many leaders. But at a local level, we have a real opportunity to rebuild our own capacity for empathy and what people are experiencing. Because if we haven't experienced that pain, we've experienced another pain, and we can meet them there. And this leads us back to having a better theology of suffering, right? And how do we engage people where they are? I, as part of the Leadership Foundation network, which is a global network, and having learned from Baki, I have done a lot of work in my own city and helping other leadership foundations in other cities do deep exegesis of their own cities, right? Which is what you're describing here. How do we know what's going on in our relational and social fields, wherever our organization is based? It might not be your whole city, but it could be a community or a neighborhood. What are the needs, and how can we address those and meet those? If we are not proactively engaging those, then we're missing the opportunity that God's presented to us through this very challenging season and time, and to be the church, right, in lots of ways, like never before.
Some of that, if I can build on that, if you can create the feedback loop to your own constituents, your community, that you're doing this work, and you have this reporting, that does help them with their own sense making. In a sense, they now have a shepherding voice in their life.
Yep.
A nurturing, a maternal voice almost.
Yeah.
It's going to be okay. We're tuning in, we're tracking. Here's where we're at today. And we're going to keep you kind of informed on how we're progressing. And that, comparing doom scrolling,
right,
to a shepherding voice, or more the maternal part of the church's existence.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift for a lot of people. That is more than just, are they physically well, but are they connected to a place that's empathetic, Lisa, when you say that?
Yeah.
And that empathy becomes a form of that sense making, probing, it's the emotional version of that.
That's right. And I think that to the extent that people have that shepherding voice, that is validating their experience and affirming them, makes them feel seen and heard and known, which is the most important thing we can offer to anybody right now, is to let them know that they're valuable, and that we care, and that we might not be able to fix all their problems, but we see them and we know them, we understand, and empathize with their circumstance, and we want to be a resource and a support. Is very, very, people are very isolated right now. And it's easy to, I mean, we're seeing increased rates of, suicide and other extreme mental health, deteriorations because of this. And if people could just have a place to go in their local community where they felt seen and heard and known, maybe we could put a dent in that increase.
In the question, I also, heard an element of interorganizational, not just, who you serve.
Sure.
That's where empathy certainly plays a key role, because we are still in a time of uncertainty, and for some organizations, either that their livelihood depends on, or the ministry of that organization is necessary or important to their lives, to hear that those organizations are thinking radical thoughts, right? And kind of reconsidering who they are and what they're to be, that can cause uncertainty and angst as well.
Sure.
So it's how to be bivocal, multivocal, and who's ready for the conversation and who perhaps need not be. The message, stability, and security, and predictability at one level, and yet also undertake this the probing and making sense at the same time. Because for some, that probing, making sense will, they'll feel the tremors within the organization, and that may produce anxiety, or it can be a calming thing that you're thinking. I'm not articulating it well, but it's finding that balance both within and without the organization.
Yeah.
So as we go through this time of shift and reflection, probing, making sense, that we are still kind of focused on mission. There's some predictability, and the people who rely on us, they have a sense of security, that we're not only going to be there for them, but we are anticipating what being there for them will mean 4, 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
Yeah.
And so it's be able to communicate that, that sense of calm,
that's
and the empathy, address the feelings of but also being positive. And I think that's being creative and saying, yeah, but we need to explore. This is an interesting exercise to explore and discern. And that's where then you have different levels of conversation with different personality types.
I think people are hungry for that calm, Bruce, that non-anxious presence, right? And because there's just this low level of anxiety just everywhere right now. And as leaders, if we haven't cultivated our own inner calm and navigated through our own anxiety at some level, we certainly can't give away to others if we don't possess it ourselves, right? So we must, it becomes increasingly important to turn the phone off for a day and disconnect and restore your own emotional and spiritual and mental well-being, because people are leaning and looking to you for the calm, and because they're not finding it in the places where they normally have. So if we're frantic running around talking to 1 million people and 12 hours a day on Zoom, we're not caring for the people that God has called us to serve very well.
Manuel had a follow-up question for Tim. Tim, did you I think you saw that. Is there anything you wanted to share from that?
Is that the question about the community hermeneutic?
Yeah, it had yes, he was asking what and how can network, no, this was an earlier one. Yeah, it was the question about how do we create hermeneutical communities within our own organizations to carry this out.
Well, I took his question as around how do we do that kind of community hermeneutic or really know our community well. So I hope I'm reading the question correctly. The tool that's being built right now, again, at least you said for fear of self-promotion, I don't want to use this for self-promotion.
Go
But,
for
right
it's hard to
ahead.
it's hard to answer the question without mentioning this, I think. Waybase 2.0 is a collaborative project that is taken input from organizations across Canada. A lot of them are community development organizations and international community development. The Canadian Relief and Development Association has been a key partner, as well as major mission organizations like Young Street Mission and Salvation Army and Union Gospel Mission. A lot of these large city missions have given input to build out this new version that's coming out. And it's designed around three primary functions. One's called Discover, which is discovering your city, be able to communicate to leaders in your area. And it has notifications, so you don't have to check it regularly. You can kind of find out what's happening, what the needs are, what the causes are that need attention, the needs are. But then the second function is research, which gets into the community hermeneutic, where you can actually get in and it combines ministry data and demographic data. And you can literally go right down to a postal code, and you can analyze that from low income indicators, age ranges, from like, are there seniors living here? Are there children that may be, large children, a large number of families with children that have low income indicators or different language groups, et cetera. And to be able to compare that directly to the ministries in the area and what they offer and who they are, so that you kind of can start to identify those places where there might be gaps starting to exist, and improve your conversations when you're talking locally of how do we respond. There's a third part coming out. I won't take time. You can take a look. It's called Engage, which is about mobilizing your people individually. The tool that's being built. I'm not a technologist. It's a gap that actually emerged. I'll give a shout out to Bruce on this. This whole project goes back to something Rick Heemstra from your team said. This should be done. This should be built for Canada. And then a group of millennial leaders from across the country, from all faith tradition, participated in a 12-week think tank. And lifting up out of that was this platform, a concept of a platform that would allow the church to be able to interact and really know itself and know the opportunities in their communities. So it's been a multi-year process with tons of input. And we just happened to be the week before. Waybase 2.0 will get turned on next week, and then we're planning to have it fully ready for early January to take across the country. Some people have said, actually, what's weird about this, when this started, it was like, okay, this seems like something the Lord wants. But now that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, we've had people say to us, I think God wanted you to build this team to build this, because they're mostly millennials building this, right? Data cleaning and all this stuff for this pandemic. When it'll be the worst time of the pandemic, which will probably be January to April, will probably be our darkest part of the time.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So anyways, I just give that as a response, not to be too promoting of the team that I support, but I do think that type of work, using these types of tools, but then doing the relational work necessary is going to be, I think this is a chance. I'll go back to something. The chief health medical officer from Nova Scotia said this when we were doing a consulting call with him, a national consulting call back in the spring. He said, this is the chance for the church to be the church. Right? Yeah. You don't have to be anything other than who you are. Just be who you are. Yeah. Be those community caring people who are out helping people and doing that, in the name of Jesus, with the love of Jesus in your hearts. Just, this is your chance. Yeah. And I took that to heart. Like, I almost felt like God was speaking. It's like one of those moments, like, I think God is actually just like speaking right in this moment. Yeah. That we're not actually at risk. This is probably our best opportunity ever to truly live the message of Jesus when Canada and our cities and our communities and neighbors need us to care.
That's a fabulous benediction, Tim. Thank you for that.
Mm.
A number of folks have given their apologies. They've had to go on to other meetings, maybe other Zoom meetings.
Almost guaranteed.
Almost guaranteed.
Right. A few went to Skype. Anyway, it leaves us at a place where we should say thank you to especially Bruce and Tim and Lisa. Thank you for leading us off, Lisa, with that
My pleasure.
very solid set of provocations and observations about the place we're in. Tim and Bruce have connected us, I think, with their experience and their networks from coast to coast, literally. They have drawn from all these relationships that they've spent years building, and in Tim's case, now mapping and making available to so many people. So we wish you the best in the next week as Waybase 2 launches. And Lisa, as you carry on your work, I'm fascinated to hear about your conversation coming up with the Dupree Center.
Yeah.
It's a place that I respect deeply. It's also my alma mater, so I'm biased, but,
there we go.
Bruce, with your hundreds of affiliates, much wisdom and peace to you as you guide and shepherd and also herd the cats. That's an amazing role that you have in this moment as well. There is an outstanding question from Manuel, and we'll respond to that perhaps by text. We want to thank as well the folks that and the organizations that have continued to partner with us, particularly Tim at Waybase, the CCRDA, EFC, and Wycliffe College. And Steve Huco will be sending out a survey to all the participants so that we can learn. And the last thing to say is that there will be 3 more events coming up in Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And they are spaced out more or less 2 to 4 weeks apart. We'll be covering off issues of how do you survive on the fundraising side in the midst of this pandemic with Dave Toyson. We have a session in January coming up on race and diversity in organizations in this moment. And then the final session in February with Andy Crouch, who will be almost a year from the original publication of Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And it'll be very interesting, I think, to have him cap what we're doing here together. So blessings to you all.